obviously you need experience. You have to know what you're talking about. And what aspect of food writing? Food writing is so diverse, whether you want to talk about health policies, whether you want to talk about political, economic, whether you want to talk about purely aesthetics. What do you want to say about food? And do you know that starting out? You sort of have to develop experience to know what you want to write about. In some ways, it's a little easier than it used to be because of blogs. There have been people who started blogs that became quite sensational and led to almost instant careers. I'm thinking of the young woman who cooked all the recipes in the Julia, whatever that was called. And it got to be very well known, and the New York Times did an article on it. That saved her many, many years of working her way up on a magazine or a newspaper. So if somebody is really sensational and does, in-your-face things and gets picked up, you save a lot of steps, but that's not going to happen to too many people. It's sort of difficult to find out why they want to write about food. Do they have a feeling that something's wrong with food, or that people aren't doing the right thing about food, or do they just think it's a glamorous career to write about food and you're going to go from one restaurant to another and someone's going to pay for it? And so it's very hard without them having a cause. If you're the next Michael Pollan, you want to write because you're advocating something. There are plenty of places to be a critic. You don't make a lot of money. There are not too many places paying big expenses. So are you going to take a meal for free and be a critic? And always I would say to get something published as soon as you can, wherever you can, even if it's on a little local home paper, because then you begin to have printed samples to show. And that always counts for a lot, even if it's in a very, very minor type of medium. Agony. I hate to write. Hate it. Do anything other than write. I'm always late with copy. Maybe if I knew I could cure it. I always say this time it's going to be different. I think there's something, and I've heard other people say it, there's nothing like the paralysis of looking at a blank sheet of white paper. And you sit down and you think, okay, I'm going to write this. And then, what word am I going to use first? One way I have found to make it a little easier is to write the parts I'm sure of first, and then see what's missing and where I want to put them. I always know certain things I want to say in a certain way. So eventually, when the editor is calling and say, where is it already? I start on the parts I'm sure of, and then it's like a jigsaw puzzle. Then I fit all the other pieces in. I think what changed me most of all was when I stopped thinking of it as writing and I thought of it as saying something. It was not a question of what do you want to write, but if someone says, what do you want to say, I have no trouble at all. And I think when they put the critic's pen in my hand, it was much easier because I wanted to make my point. And I always thought if I were ever to teach a class in writing, I would say stop thinking of it as writing and start thinking of it as saying something. Because many people, including myself, who have trouble writing, have no trouble writing a letter or a memorandum because it's what you think. And so I became very intent upon having my thoughts clear. I didn't know if I wanted to be an advertising copywriter. I had no thought of having a food career or a journalist. So I majored in marketing and minored in journalism. And at that time, that was called the School of Commerce. My first job was at an ad agency that served many retail stores around the country, small stores. And the categories they gave me to write about were jewelry and home furnishings. And when I went looking for the next job after graduating from college, I got a job as a home furnishings copywriter at Good Housekeeping because of the home furnishings advertising. And that's what got me into the magazine world. Food was something of a hobby, so when the day's work was done, I was at markets and food shops and restaurants and buying cookbooks in languages I didn't understand. And so that was the hobby part. And then at 17, the food editor left. And the editor said, I know you love food and it isn't such a big deal on 17. Would you like to do food as well as home furnishings? So I did. But then when I went to House Beautiful, it wasn't that. But finally, when I decided to freelance, there was much more work and much more interesting in food. It's very hard to freelance home furnishings. It's much easier to freelance with food. And for 20 years, I did freelance. A newspaper was a perfect place for me, and I never knew that. I worked on magazines always until I went to the Times. But the shorter the deadline, the sooner I'll write it. So that was, and you know, there was a certain amount of space. You couldn't wander all over the map. And it was much easier doing that, and it was very fresh in my head. I never took notes at a restaurant. I never wrote anything down. I have a very good memory. I did try to steal menus in the days when you had to steal menus. I was very good at that. You don't have to do it so much anymore because all of the menus are online. You just have to be sure they're current. But I always pretty well knew exactly what I wanted to say, how many words I had to say it, and that was not as difficult. In my home, food was talked about in two ways. It was talked about in terms of products, mostly fruits and vegetables, and then it was discussed in preparation about anything we were eating at dinner or eating together. We always talked about what we were having and if we liked it this way or didn't like it that way. And my mother would compare her way of doing it to someone else's, an aunt or a restaurant. She was a very competitive cook. So in between other conversations about our day at dinner, we talked about the food. My father, who was in the wholesale fruit and produce business, would talk about the fruits and vegetables that had come in that day from all over the country, which he liked, which he didn't like. He didn't like apples from the West Coast because there weren't enough cold nights. He liked apples from New York and Massachusetts, and so do I. He thought Florida oranges were not nearly as good as California, but Florida grapefruit were far better than those from California, Indian River, and I still to this day, at least once in winter, order some Indian River white grapefruit just to keep the family tradition going. So I think without ever considering being a food critic or writing about food, I was critical about food all the time. But also, you know, there's a lot of excitement in a restaurant room. All kinds of things are going on that have nothing to do with the food, little dramas at every table. There used to be a radio program about a hotel. I forgot what it was called, but they introduced by saying, you know, 100 rooms and in every room a story. So I feel at every table there's a story, and I'm a pretty good eavesdropper. So, you know, people get fired, people get hired, romances break up or begin. A lot going on in a restaurant beside eating. And I could almost feel the vibrations in the air of what someone called the airy footsteps of the things that almost happen. So they're exciting to me at all levels, and I'm interested in the structure. That under what's going on, there's a business framework and a production framework, no matter what the restaurant is. Well, I think one can know the stories behind the chef. One can understand the problems of running a restaurant, but I always put that out of my mind in evaluating it because being in a restaurant, it's an invitation to buy something. And therefore, I paid attention to the food and the service. Nothing mattered about anybody's background if what was on the plate wasn't right. I have often said that I would rather evaluate someone by his achievements and not by his goals. Right now, there's a trend in reviewing to tell you what a chef's goal is, what his purpose is, giving the reader or the diner the feeling that you have to understand and allow for it. And I don't feel you have to understand or allow for anything. A meal is not an oil painting. You may want one or another kind of ambiance depending upon the occasion. I understand that. You might want to eat different kinds of food every night. I understand that. But I think too much is made of it being an art, and it's not an art. It may be artistic and it may have artistry in it, but cooking is not an art. It's a combination of artfulness, science, and craft. And I don't think that the diner should understand anything about the problems of the owner or the chef. My gauzes, I didn't go costumed, but I had 3 different wigs. And I had a lot of eyeglass frames with plain glass in them because I've never really worn glasses, so nobody would expect that. The rest of me was just dressed normally. In the beginning, I would say the first 2 or 3 years at the Times, I was rarely recognized. Gradually, as things went along, people might recognize my husband. One of the most embarrassing things is to walk in with a wig and glasses and have one say, "Good evening, Miss Sheraton." And that began to happen after a while. I always made reservations in another name. If I thought I might be recognized, I would have the other couple we were eating with that night, and we were usually 4 people, arrive first and see if they got the table that was ordered and how they were treated. And that was very telling. They would do things like, there used to be dessert wagons with a lot of cakes on them. If I were there at, say, 9 or 9:30 at night and some of those cakes were all cut up and there was only one piece left, out went the pastry cart and in came all new cakes. And you know that owner didn't want to cut into a new cake at 9:30 at night. But they did. They've changed bread on tables. In one restaurant that had an older, better restaurant directly across the street, they brought the chef in from that restaurant. I happened to recognize him, and I saw him coming in to the other place. So there all kinds of things have happened, and it would be very difficult now. I don't think I could be a critic in New York now without being anonymous, because it's almost impossible to do it the way I do it if you're known. You go enough times, you try and fool them, but there's always something they can do. A lot of people say, what can they do once you're in the restaurant if they didn't expect you? And I once wrote an article for Vanity Fair on what they can do when they suddenly know you're there. And I had a whole list of things, and I had a phone call from the late Adi Giovanetti, who had a very good Italian restaurant called Il Nido. And he said, "Signora, you don't know the half of it. We can do much more than that. If you order an appetizer, we have plenty of time to fix up the main course, and our staff even knows how to quiet people if there are noisy people around you." Well, my whole work is, even my own writing, I have 1,000 foods to eat before you die, was 10 years of research. Not only picking the foods I thought, but what about them, and lore, is there any lore, technicalities and sources, because everything had to be sourced, had to be available one way or another. So research is what it's all about, and that's why I have almost never been able to hire a researcher. They wouldn't do it the way I would do it, and if you send someone out to look for something specific, they will look for that specific. But there is the serendipitous find that while you're on your way to this page, you see something that says, you know. So I've never trusted, if I've had a researcher, I've always gone back and checked. Every time I sat down to write, this is going to be a beautiful piece. I'm really going to do this beautifully. It got later and later and later, and I thought maybe it better just be clear this time, and I'll be beautiful next time. And I think you say, you know, what has changed me as a writer? I would say that when I became a critic, and I wanted very much to have my point of view understood, I had no trouble at all. I think it's very important not to be swept away by the glamour of things. This is what I mind about so many reviews today. They're so colorful. The reviews are so entertaining. They refer so much to the current zeitgeist, so that there's already established an aura around going to a restaurant that you want to be there for many reasons. I think there are just a couple of reasons to be there. The mood of the place for your mood and the food on the plate, and you shouldn't be conned into liking something you don't like because there's either a glamorous story about the chef, or because of the clientele a place attracts, or because the reviewer has, I don't know, referred to too many aspects of contemporary life. I could name the reviewers that do it, but I'm not going to do that. My reviews were often declared clinical. That was a negative reaction by others in my field, and they're damn right. Because my first love, I think, was science. I think what I really wanted to be was either a doctor or a medical researcher. I was swept away the first time I was given a microscope in a kid's chemistry set, that there are things to see if you know how to look. So I am very suspicious of, I don't want to say, but that's what I mean, of hype. Hype is, to me, you know, when I want to spread it all apart and see what's there for myself. And when I look at a menu, I want to see, what is this like, what is this like, what is that like? Now, don't tell me anything about it, show it to me. So, you know, I admire archaeologists because they dig under the surface and find things. I admire all sorts of scientists who look through a microscope and see what's there. And I like to look through things and see what is really there.